Misha here, and today I felt like doing something a little short and sweet. Not talking about Arisakas again, but rather the Type 30 bayonet and how it didn't change for a very long time and then changed a lot in the last 5-6 years of production. The bayonet was, of course, very important to Japan and its war effort in both symbolic, morale terms, and frankly also combat terms late in the war when bullets were not always available. So we're going to kind of go over them, quick to the point, and this video is also dedicated to Jerry. Why is that? Well, he helped me kind of fix a mistake I did to myself, an oopsie, a couple of years back. We'll explain. And yes, this is very long. This is the original Type 30 in 6.5 by 55 semi-rimmed, the true Arisaka, adopted in 1897. Yeah, very long. And adopted alongside it is its here bayonet, also known as the Type 30. Now, the Murata, both the original single shot and the later repeater at 8mm, of course they had bayonets too, but they were an older style. They were socket, mostly the spike type. Late on they did blades, but European nations, which Japan was often using as models and even assistants to kind of modernize and become what they wanted to be, a regional power in the Meiji era, they looked at what Europe was doing, and they were doing relatively long. Quick reminder before we get too deep, if you please could like, share, subscribe, that'd be awesome. Share us on social media. Commenting helps a lot. There's also super thanks, and there's always a link to Patreon. Blades. At least for their carbines. Shorter guns, 18, 20-inch barrels. Now, in the late 19th century, a lot of European long rifles, 30 inches, 32, actually used a shorter type of bayonet. But Japanese, partially just kind of based on their warrior samurai tradition and use with the blade, and yes, also partially to kind of make up for their smaller stature, kind of just did a one-size-fits-all blade here and bayonet, introduced alongside the, not my cat, don't worry, neighborhood cat, rifle itself. And this is a relatively early pattern with a earlier style metal scabbard, which is one element Jerry helped me with recently. What do we have here? Pretty traditional bayonet lug. The blade is just under 16 inches. We'll just call it 16. It basically just has one edge. Some consider the tip here a false edge. If so, it's very slight. We do have a fuller groove. Some call it a blood groove. It's really not, but there you go. And the blade originally was left in the white. I've read different reasons why, but it was a very common bayonet making technique to leave it unblued, polished up. It looked good for parades. It was probably easier to clean, just in the white, easier to sharpen. You're not wearing off your blue. Makes sense. The hardware down here, the grip, crossguard, the pommel, they were often blued though, even from the beginning. We have a hooked quillion crossguard. There are two reasons often given. One is a blade breaker. I don't really think so. But a blade capturer, to kind of hook something in there, that makes more sense to me. And I think it was also just a flourish. It was kind of the way bayonets were. It kept you from having a crossguard just sticking out, kind of curved it up and made it smooth so it wouldn't hook on things on the bottom. Of course, you could hook on there. But when you look at the original British smelly bayonets. They also had a hooked quillion. Very nice taper to the ring here, bird's head, and two-piece wood grip held on, very nicely fitted screws, very usually nicely fitted wood, high grade. Now, the bayonets would have a serial number, but this is what's kind of interesting. They weren't serialized to their guns, even though some bayonets may not fit all guns, especially as time goes on. You know, they tried to standardize, but there you go. And we have a very long implement here. Yes, I'm aware probably the camera is making this look bend, so enjoy. This was the common gun. And in the early days, say before and at the very beginning of the Russo-Japanese War, up to 1904, production of the bayonet was relatively low, mostly done at the Tokyo arsenal. But of course, with that war, production would be ramped up, and more contractors would be let out to make these. Originally, early on, pre-production, when the Type 30 carbine was being developed, it did not have a bayonet lug. But they discovered that it would not just be for cavalry, because they had sabers, that was the original reason. It could also go to artillery crews, communications, signals crews. So really by the time the Type 30 was in full production, it had a lug. And that would be carried over to the Type 38. Those were, short little carbines, roughly 19-inch barrels. And so they would be issued with the same bayonet, although not always. Just because the lug was there doesn't mean the individual soldier got it. But this is how the bayonets looked before and during the Russo-Japanese War and through World War I. There's very little changes aside from just minor differences in manufacturing. Japan is still modernizing, so we see more variants from individual makers than we might other places, but there's still a standard form, and the changes are very different. We have maker marks here, nicely stamped. Everything's very nice on these. They put a lot of time and effort because, once they adopted the Type 38 rifle, carbine, they kept on with the Type 30 bayonet. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. But then there was this other one you might have glimpsed on the table at the beginning. The Type 44. And this is actually a so-called third variant, so it's more of a 1930s and World War II era. This was designed for the cavalry, adopted in 1911, and produced in relatively small numbers, a little over 91,000, over roughly a 30-year production run. Now, as I said, the cavalry would have sabers, but that wasn't always useful. But they didn't want to issue them both a saber and a bayonet, so they made essentially a Type 38 carbine, same length of barrel, although the sight's put in a different place, and they're not just the same barrel of action underneath the furniture, they are different. But basically, they just added a blade here, roughly 14 inches, giving basically the same length as this guy here, maybe just slightly shorter, but they're kind of limited in how far it can fold up into the stock. Notice it has the hooked quillion that's built into the gun. And this is, again, the third variant, which has a reinforced bayonet mount. You can tell they took this serious because every time they improved the 44, this is mostly where they did, strengthening this area up here. So it was very important to them, as you can see. This is still in 6.5 and kind of one of my favorite Japanese sub-variants, but it did not replace the Type 38 carbine, but it was there. Therefore, the spike bayonet really only appears on this as far as full production, although some prototypes, they did experiment with that. And they would keep making these into the early days of World War II. But nope, this would be the standard, and pretty much the one version model outside of some very rare deviations and prototypes and what have you. So that gets us through World War I into the interwar period, and then the Second Sino-Japanese War. You can hear the Japanese planes coming. This is one of the guns I really enjoy in my collection. I don't think it's worth much of anything, but it's a neat variation. This is the Type 38 cavalry rifle, or short rifle, kind of the prototypical Type 99, but of course this is still in 6.5. As they would go into China more, they would take some old Type 38 rifles and cut the barrels from, and I'm just rounding, guys, 31 inches down to just under 26, although some are 24. It's a little variable because they did them at different times at different places, making a shorter, handier gun, also maybe getting rid of some worn rifling at the muzzle. I think this really led the way for the Type 99 short rifle becoming the standard later on. And of course these took the Type 30 bayonet, but as you notice, this one here is a little different. If I can get it off, like I said, fitment can be a little troublesome on these Japanese guns. Let's see here, still fits, but a little tight, and that is one of our indications of changing manufacturing. And this is the bayonet that Jerry helped with, although not the scabbard. This scabbard is actually what my earlier Type hooked quillion came in. Been there for years, but it's not correct. Notice this cylindrical end. It needed the ball tip end, and that was the scabbard this actually came in. There's also some differences back here with the belt hanger, the frog attachment. You can see on them, just more simplified on this one. So this scabbard is more appropriate for this bayonet, and this scabbard is more appropriate for this bayonet. So that was pretty neat to begin with. By this point, by the way, Tokyo had given away to Kokura. Nagoya was making bayonets and, subcontracting others out too. Here is this style. One of the first changes they made around 1936, 37, sources disagree, we don't really have factory records, was going to just an all-blued construction. No longer doing the polished blade, just making it blued like everything else. Also, the fuller groove is a little more hastily machined. This one's got, more rounded edges, just like scooped out, versus the more squared off we saw in the earlier one. Crossguard still has this nice, elegant taper here. Still have a bird's head on the rear. Still have well-fitted wood grips. Notice how they join here. There would be some variations in just makers how they did their grips. But of course, the other big thing here, aside from the blade, is the straight crossguard. This seems to have come into service a little after the blue blade. Again, I'm just speculating. If you know better, please do let me know. And this is when you start to see more and more subcontractors. There's like this period between 1938 and 1942 where a lot of this happens at different factories. Sometime in that period, the straight crossguard came in. It's just easier to machine. You could argue the hook was a flourish that just wasn't needed, and it could literally hook on things. Whatever. So this would have been used on late production Type 38s and the original Type 99s, although maybe early 99s still would have had a hooked crossguard, but a blued blade. And again, these are all interchangeable, so anything could happen, because by this point they're making these in the millions. And you might be wondering why I didn't have a straight crossguard version. This is actually what Jerry recently found for me, and I got to give credit there. He's just one of those guys. I could kind of mention to him that I've been looking for this specific style, fullered blade straight crossguard. It's harder to find than you'd think because it's transitional. I also needed a round-tipped scabbard if I had it. I had another one, round-tipped, but it was pretty rough condition. I wanted a little bit better one. I'm not perfection picky, but And he said he was at a gun show. Oh yeah, and he saw a bayonet there, and guy had it, and he described it as, "Oh, Jerry, I wish you'd called me. That's exactly the type I've been looking for." And he said, "Well, I know the guy. I'll go call him up and drive over and get it." And I was like, "Oh, you don't have to do that." He did anyway. And I tell him too, because he's also a bayonet collector, probably more than me, frankly. A lot of my coolest bayonets have come from him over the years. And I reminded him before he traded me this one, and it was a trade. I had a magazine he needed, so fair and fair. I had something he needed, he had something I wanted. But I reminded him, Jerry, you don't have this transitional variant in your Japanese collection. You've got the early styles and everything, and, you know, the unfullered blade. And, you know, he knew that, but he knew how much I like Japanese, so he's like, okay, well, you know, next time, but he let me have it. So I did try to do the good friend thing, and he did the good friend thing, so it worked out very well, and this is what kind of let me do this video for you. Now, you might be asking, why didn't I have a transitional? Well, I did, but I was an idiot. More on that later. But with that, let's move into the mid-war. This is kind of a transitional Type 99, made in 43. Still has the adjustable sights and nicely checkered safety, but the AA sights, the monopod are long gone. It has the simplified cleaning rod, and just because it fit this gun better, I don't know what's up with this exact bayonet. It didn't really want to fit any of my later guns. That's just how they are kind of getting at the end of the war. We have a so-called substitute Type 30 bayonet, or last ditch. And here we can really, just like with last ditch rifles, substitute Type 99s, there are some major variations here. So this is just one. We'll look at a couple. These are pretty cool, and I got several of these from my old friend John when he was getting out of Japanese when he retired. I picked this one to start with because it still retains some features. Let's set the scabbard aside, being very gingerly with it. I suggest pulling them by the metal collar if you have one. Here's our blade. The blade itself really hasn't changed as far as length and edge, but as you, I'm sure, noticed, there's no fuller groove. There are some transitional ones where there's a very rough cut groove as well. By this point, these are all going to be blued, maybe blackened. I've seen also painted ones. Hard to say exactly when they were painted, but... And I have seen some, as we'll get to in a minute, where, you know, they kind of go back to doing it in the white just because resources. Now, the crossguard on this one looks very similar to the last one. It still has the elegant taper. It still is machined down here. We still have a bird's head grip back here, or pommel, I should say. The grip still has a curve to it. It still meets up the two pieces of wood quite well. One thing you will start to see is the screws and the washers can get a little more crude. These are still pretty decent on this one, I would say. But this is, to me, an early, late style. Now, by this point, we have lots of subcontractors all across Japan. In fact, the company that would become Panasonic made bayonets. Of course, Nagoya has several companies working for them. Kokura. And they're made overseas too, and at least marked. And markings get pretty erratic at this point, as you'd imagine, by 1944. And then, of course, there's the scabbard over here, in the very loosest terms. This has basically stamped metal here, and a little pinned-on, riveted-on stamped metal cap here. And then it's two pieces of bamboo wood joined together and held together with twine, essentially braided rope. It's so hard to find these that haven't busted, cracked, and I think you can understand why. But it did save metal resources, and it was easier to take wood because it didn't have to be super high grade, and tie it together. So this is, to me, one of the earlier style last ditch types. And what's ironic, even though that is, including myself, what everyone wants, I do actually feel like the transitional here with the fuller and straight crossguard, you don't see near as many of these. Now, you see more of the cylindrical tip scabbards. I think they actually came into service around the 1930s, but they were pretty quickly replaced by the unfullered blade and eventually wood scabbard. I've also seen reports that say sometimes there would be like a leather wrap around the top part, but I don't know. They could just be mistaking lacquer on the wood. Let me know if you know in the comments. But wait, there's more. Or less. I know we're losing light, so we'll wrap this up. We'll move from this one here, which is very much a last ditch, to this one, which just takes it that little bit further. Still has the bird's head type pommel, but the grips are almost just straight slab. They're not, ready S tier. The screws, the washers, the nuts are getting simpler. Notice the gap. Now, some makers always kind of left more of a gap here than others, but this one's got a hole in it, so kind of goes to show you. And while we still have a machined crossguard, this bar stock is left more just open here. It's just a little bit thicker, chunkier. The scabbard on this is pretty neat. It's probably one of my better last-ditch style scabbards. It's held together pretty well. It feels a little sturdier with more lacquer on it. And here's our blade. No real change here. Again, the finish, just like on a last-ditch gun, will get cruder. This one still has nice stamping. It's probably one of my nicer late-style bayonets. I don't know if it's just me, but the blade on this feels a little thick, too. In this pattern, you'll see from places like Nagoya and a lot of the subcontractors. Make sure I put it on the right way. There is a one way because of the way the blade is shaped. But then you get to late 44 or 45, and they, at least in some instances, find ways to even simplify this further. This is another one of my kind of favorites. This is my Jensen or Yunzong. Basically, occupied Korea make. Last ditch. And I got this thanks to Bill White. And all parties were fair on it. It's a pretty cool gun. It also shows you some of the late war simplifications, like the square top. This is one of the crudest last ditches. Not a rope hole, but their own little thing. And Yunzong and Nagoya both are known to have made this style of bayonet here, which is about as simple as you can get it. Let's check it out. The scabbard here isn't really different. I've read reports of some not even having a metal tip. This one definitely does. It's got the bands. They're definitely wood. But the blade, you can see here, and there's a little bit of kind of old grease on this one. You see, it's just old Cosmo, so it looks a little rough, but it's kind of leaving on. It has the very square grips with squared off screws. By this point, the bird's head pommel completely gone, just a block back here. And the same goes for the crossguard. This is, to me, really cool. This is just bar stock steel. And I'm sure the original manufacturer started off with this straight piece, this rectangular piece. Normally they would machine it down. That's why I've been pointing it out throughout the video. Nope, this one they just drill the hole for the muzzle. These can be drilled off center. That's not unheard of. In fact, I think mine is slightly drilled to that direction, however you want to call it, to your left. Yeah, I'm going to say so. I think the right here is slightly thicker than the left. And of course they drill a hole for the blade to pass through. But that's it. That's all they got. So they have simplified this almost as far as they can go and still have it literally attach onto a gun, because even though the last ditch guns, even rope holes and whatnot, have eliminated cleaning rods and all that, even sling swivels, one thing they've kept is bayonet mounts. And so they do need bayonets for them. Not every maker went to this exact late style. Like I said, as far as I know, Nagoya and Yinson did. Toyota also made some, I believe, but I'm not near as well versed on bayonets, and that's because I can't see markings, and it's kind of hard researching this when you can't see markings. One fun fact you notice of this, the grips do meet in the middle, unlike the previous one. Just kind of goes to show you how different makers made changes. Now, I said at the beginning, you know, why do they keep doing bayonets? Well, part of it was tradition. Part of it was, you know, if you're out of bullets, bonsai charges were taught even up to the end. And if they became more like kamikaze charges, yes, I know the Army used a different term, but you know what I mean. And if you're just out of bullets, you know, of course, in jungle warfare, close quarters, caves, pillboxes, a long bayonet like this, 16 inches, on a short rifle with a barrel under 26 inches, it gives you some reach. It makes more sense than you would think. At least it gives them something. So I think a lot of times the late style ones, even though they could definitely still attach to a gun, a lot of times they were just used as a fighting blade. But really, even from the very beginning, that was in their mind. They wanted not just a bayonet, but something that could be used on its own is a fighting implement here. And with that, let's end with my story of being a bit of an idiot. The reason I was so happy when my friend found me this bayonet and this scabbard, and I knew I could switch them. I did have a couple of nice ones. I even had a blued blade hooked quillion. Not having that now doesn't bother me, but getting rid of my straight guard did. It wasn't intentional. Years ago, around 2020, I picked up quite a few guns from a gentleman local. That's where that Type 0 came from, we recently looked at. And most of his guns had bayonets, so I had a stack of bayonets. And again, they're not serialized to their individual guns, so we can't just go serial here, so there. So I would usually just sell the bayonets off separately on Gunbroker, eBay, wherever. And I always made a rule about separating my bayonets from those. And I kept to that very well with my last ditch types. But somehow my early style ones and the transitionals got mixed in with the store's bayonets, basically. I think I was moving stuff around, set them in a pile, got distracted, and then found, oh, there's 3 more bayonets I didn't know I had. I accidentally sold my bayonets. Luckily, it was only, I think, 2, maybe 3. And again, the blued with the quillion, that's fine. It's a cool variation, but I don't have to have it. But this one, this style, really, really irked me. Because it was right in the middle, and it meant that I didn't have even a ball scabbard for my early one. So my early one wasn't correct. And I missed that piece in between. I had several last ditch types, as you've seen. It just irked me. And for about a year and a half, I've been on the lookout for one of these local. I wasn't hopping online. I can't really bid on auctions successfully because reasons, you know, I can't see pictures. So I figured I would. And there was actually a false alarm a few months ago. Same friend found me a straight grass guard with a ball tip metal scabbard, but when he brought it over, it actually had an unfullered blade. I took it in. It wasn't a big deal. I moved it along. It was actually very, very similar to, I believe, this one here. It just had a metal scabbard instead of wood. I'm sure what happened, the original bamboo scabbard got busted and someone put it in a metal one because it was the ball-tipped style. So that kind of bummed me out. I was all excited a few months ago thinking I could finally fix my oopsie. But this time it worked out Jim Dandy. And I had my friend to thank. As a fellow collector, he could have very easily said, look, I found it. I drove out of my way to get it twice. Yeah, and what's crazy is during the same week he did it again for a different type of bayonet, a British one. But that's kind of a story for next time as we lose light out here. I just wanted to talk about the Type 30 bayonet, produced really from 1897 through 1945 by dozens of makers, contractors, subcontractors, and the big boys too, Tokyo, Kokura, Nagoya. As you might imagine, the whole concept of light and lighting is a mystery to me. Anyway, I put a light on the camera because I know it's getting dim here. Late fall in the south. We have them all lined up with the scabbard. What do you think? How many did they build? Estimates say over 8 million. Some say up to 9, but that's disputed. 8 seems to be at least common, which makes perfect sense because they went to everything. They never really went away from this style of bayonet. The Type 44 had its own, but that was a small production run. And there was the Type 2, the paratrooper bayonet. But considering just how few paratrooper guns were made, that can tell you just how few of those bayonets were made. And there were a few others like the Type 5, but really it's the Type 30. Now there are some late war reports of shorter blades, around 12, 13 inches I've read of. I've never owned one myself though, so you get to the late wars, you can tell. I mean, most of our variations are there. Early on, they were very uniform, very consistent, very professional about making these. Bayonets are not my specialty, so please, in the comments, share interesting facts that you know. I'd love to hear them. Where I kind of run into trouble with Japanese, if it's a European bayonet, I can usually ask my wife or a family member or a friend, hey, what's that say? And I can look up the codes. German bayonets are good for that. Look up the codes, there you go. The issue I have with Japanese is its symbols, and that's cool if you can look at them and you go to a website and look at the symbols. How's my wife going to describe a symbol and then I'm going to look it up? You kind of see the disconnect now. Now, could they, go on the website for me? That's a lot of work to ask someone to do, and I tried not to as best I can, and it's just, how it goes. But I'm happy with these. I think it represents Japanese bayonets pretty well, all in all. I think it's a really neat part, and you really can't have Arisakas without it, just because of how much importance they themselves placed on the bayonet. What's your favorite style? And if you would like to be like Jerry and help me and the channel out and just, doing videos, there's always Patreon. There's always super thanks on here. And just liking, sharing, subscribing, going on social media, especially with things like Japanese, because it's not a widely enjoyed thing, although I think it's a hidden gem. It's getting more attention. Back in the 90s, it was very hard to find fellow Japanese enthusiasts, and it's easier today. But yeah, if you'd like to share it, comment, do all that, that'd be great. With that, well, I think that's about all I can say. This is Misha. Catch you very soon, next time.